right. Well, I've got that. It's 9 o'clock my time. We'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. This is the Technology and Forest Carbon webinar series. Really appreciate you all joining us bright and early on a Monday morning to talk about this topic. This is an incredibly important topic, particularly related to forest carbon, and we're all dealing with new ways that we might value our forests for the carbon sequestration and the carbon storage that they provide. Along with that, there have been new innovations in technology and new decision support tools to help landowners, to help managers in natural resources better understand how some of the things work related to forest carbon and our role as managers, as landowners, to address that. So we're really happy to have this series. In terms of the schedule, this is a 3-part webinar series. Overall, our Minnesota Forest Carbon series that we've been offering through Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative and the University of Minnesota Extension, we had a program on carbon markets earlier this fall that included a field tour. We had a second field tour at the Chippewa National Forest talking about how we integrate forest management. And then this is kind of the last chunk of these, and that is looking at forest carbon and technology and how that plays a role into better understanding these processes. So I did want to mention also that we have funding through the Minnesota Forest Resources Council to help to put this webinar series on. So we're really appreciative of them for that funding. So here's the schedule. So you all should have a link from Eli Sagor that came last week, and I think he sent it again this morning with connection information for all of these webinars. And so the first one is right now. I'll introduce Susan here in a little bit, but we'll talk about kind of forest restoration and what that means. On Wednesday at this same time, we'll talk with some folks from NCX about their process using artificial intelligence to come up with ecosystem service markets related to forest carbon. And then on Friday, we'll talk with Chad Babcock from the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources about understanding the uncertainty of forest carbon maps and what that means for managers across the state and beyond. And so we are going to use Slido as a tool for collecting questions. So many of you that have attended an SFPC or extension event in the past might be familiar with this. We'll add the link there in the chat here in a little bit, but we encourage you to type your questions for the speaker into Slido. And so how that works, you click on the link, you click on this day, Monday, and then you'll see Susan's name there. And then you can type your question, you can reply to other questions, and you can also upvote questions. So if you read a question that you're really interested in as well, you can upvote it and kind of give it a vote, and we'll have a higher priority of answering that questions if you do that. And so encourage you all to type questions into that Slido system as we go throughout here this morning. And so that is all I have. And it looks like, Susan, you're ready to go. So you can go ahead and share your screen. And while you do that, it's a real pleasure to introduce Susan Cook-Patton with the Nature Conservancy. Susan is a senior forest restoration scientist, and she's done a lot with all of this work related to forest restoration with the Nature Conservancy and working with a variety of other partners. So Susan, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me early on a Monday morning. Hopefully you are making it through your first or second cup of coffee as you get started with this work week. And please do ask any questions or comments. I would really be grateful to hear your thoughts and suggestions for how we can improve our science, because we do this so that people can use it and find it helpful for their own work. So today I'm going to be talking about our efforts to try to find lower cost and more feasible opportunities to restore forest cover in the US, and we'll touch on some work specific to Minnesota. All right, so just, to start Monday with some good news, not really. What I often do is I come downstairs early, get my coffee, and start reading the news, and it's incredibly depressing to see how climate change is here and now. It's been a doozy of a year with these extreme weather events, heat domes in the Pacific Northwest, massive floods, fires. And science suggests that it's being felt all over the world. This was a study that just came out that basically yarded up all the evidence that climate change impacts have already happened, and found that these impacts have been demonstrated across 80% of the globe, where 85% of the world's population resides. I'm in Maryland and have been lucky to avoid sort of any climate disasters, but have noticed in my own backyard how the climate is changing. We just had our first frost on Friday, November 5th, I guess it was, which means the mosquitoes are finally dead and my children can play outside in the backyard again without being eaten. But it was a long time coming. So, you know, I start the day before I've had coffee reading these terrible climate stories, but am incredibly lucky that I have a job where I get to work on finding solutions to climate change. Often we think about what are the technologies that we can use to help solve climate change. And when we say technologies, we think of things like solar panels and electrical cars. But you know, what if there were this really great technology, nanofibers, that could pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in these long-term carbon stores? And oh wait, that's already been invented. It's photosynthesis, millions of years of R&D. And as you know, since it sounds like most of the folks out there are working in forests, trees are very good at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it down for climate relevant timescales. So my team works on quantifying the potential of natural climate solutions, which basically are all the different ways that we can use nature to help tackle the climate crisis. These are actions that span improved management, protection, and restoration of our world's forest, wetlands, agricultural lands, and grasslands. And unlike technological solutions for pulling carbon out of the air, like direct air capture, they come with a whole host of co-benefits. So these are things like the development and support of sustainable industries, all of the like clean air, clean water, habitat for biodiversity, improved soil fertility, as well as supporting the resilience and livelihood of cultures that have relied on our land for many, many years. So the team, this was work that happened right when I joined the Nature Conservancy, added up all the different ways that we could use nature to help tackle climate change. And the answer came to that natural climate solutions could offer a third of the mitigation that we need in 2030 to keep on a safe 2-degree warming pathway. The key thing to notice, and I don't know if you guys can actually see my mouse here, is that nature could provide a third, but I do want to emphasize that we still need 2/3 of that to come from reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. So we definitely need both nature and climate solutions, or nature and fossil fuel reductions. So that was a global analysis, but we realized that there's only so much utility that a big global study can give you, and that we really needed more precise national level estimates. And so we had another paper that came out that quantified the potential for natural climate solutions specifically in the United States. The big answer there was that nature could provide up to 1.2 billion tons per year, which is almost a quarter of net emissions in 2016, which was the latest emissions data we had at that point. And that is equivalent to removing all cars and light duty trucks off of the road. So it's a big amount of carbon that nature could help protect or pull from the atmosphere. Forest, for our discussion today, offered the greatest mitigation potential. These are actions both to restore forest cover, which we'll talk about more today, but also to improve our forest management and avoid forest conversion too. And of course, urban reforestation has a role to play. Reforestation is the single largest opportunity, but, sorry, not there yet. Just to be clear, what I mean when I say reforestation, it's that transition from less than 25% forest cover to greater than 25% forest cover in places that historically supported forest. So importantly, we're not trying to put trees where they've never occurred, trees in native grassland, are bad for biodiversity, often don't survive. These are places that once supported forest and have lost them for whatever reason. In the US, we also use the term afforestation for that, but afforestation can also be the bad kind of putting trees in native grasslands. Forest restoration is also used, as well as restoration of forest cover, but I'll try to stick with reforestation for our call today. A national level study can only get you so far. It can be fairly coarse, and so having these increasingly refined analyses of the potential for nature within a state are even more useful. And luckily, our team at the Minnesota chapter did a Minnesota-specific quantification of how much nature could provide. And perhaps not shockingly, given the amount of working in natural lands within Minnesota, they found that there was a lot of potential for nature to help tackle the climate crisis, specifically through actions deployed in Minnesota. And again, reforestation was the highest opportunity, but you'll see there's lots of opportunity within improved agricultural practices, as well as across other ecosystems too, like wetlands and grasslands. So the first two key take-homes are that reforestation is a powerful climate solution. And I'll say, especially if deployed now, sooner rather than later, because trees take a while to grow, to become established. So if we can implement them now, we will reap the benefits in a more timely manner down the road. And the other thing is that reforestation is only one tool of many, and we're going to need them all to tackle this unprecedented crisis that our globe is facing. Definitely reductions in fossil fuels, but also improved management of working lands and protection of natural ecosystems. And I promised I'd pause occasionally to see if there were any questions. So maybe Eli, if there's any that you think we could plug in now.
Thanks, Susan. No questions right now, so you can continue.
Okay, great. All right, so if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that I have a little asterisk next to largest. Reforestation is the largest opportunity. And that's for several reasons. One, it's expensive compared to other natural climate solutions. There are also barriers associated with land use change, right? Like there aren't trees on the places where we might want to restore them for a reason usually, and that can prevent people wanting to put trees back. There's also really high uncertainty around the estimate. So I'm showing you the error bar here, and you can see it's quite substantial, extends off the graph. And that's because there are lots of different ways to put trees back into the landscape. So you could sort of whole hog plant a bunch of native trees, restore native forest. You could set up a monoculture plantation, a diverse species plantation, an agroforestry system. You could just stop mowing it and let the trees regrow. And that is going to impact how much carbon you get, hence the uncertainty. There's also a lot of uncertainty around the area of opportunity. Where exactly are you going to restore those forests? And uncertainty around how much it's going to cost and how feasible it is to restore any given location. So we did a lot of additional work to try to tackle those sort of last three bullets: area, cost, and feasibility. And to do this, we built on the Reforestation Opportunity Map that was created in that first NPS US study. And there we had a pretty simplistic approach for identifying area of opportunity. It was basically, is it ecologically appropriate for greater than 25% tree cover? Yeah. Is it not currently a forest? No. It's not a city, a road, or good agricultural land? No. Therefore, it equals reforestation opportunity. And it was a large area. It was like 156 million acres. But then when you looked at individual pixels, you would see like, okay, that's the post-burn landscape, you know, that could maybe be restored. And that's some like scrubby looking area, sort of abandoned, maybe it's restorable. But oh wait, that's the power line right away. That's a golf course, like maybe not. You know, that's somebody's backyard. Like, I don't know, do they actually want to restore tree cover to that location? And so we realized we really needed to build in additional contextual details to understand where these opportunities really are. And so our ultimate goal here was try to build sort of these menus of opportunities to reforest lands across the lower 48 states to inform state and local conversations and to facilitate custom analyses. And this slide becomes particularly important because this seems to be happening in Minnesota. It just makes my heart so warm to see it happening, which I will get to. This was our paper that was published, I guess, about a year ago now. And what we did was ask, how does reforestation opportunity across the lower 48 states differ by area and location of opportunity, mitigation potential, the co-benefits that you could get from reforesting those locations, as well as cost and feasibility. And our menu included 10 items. The first was to try to find locations that were already allocated to a natural land use, under the idea that if they're already used for some sort of natural purpose, it might be easier to just restore additional tree cover to those landscapes. So we focused on non-stocked forest patches within forest areas, places that had shrub cover but could support forests naturally, as well as protected lands, so federal, state, private protected lands. We looked for places, this is more relevant out west, that were post-fire, and particularly tried to find the locations that had burned and had not come back, suggesting that they needed assistance recovering. Our next sort of general bucket of category of types are locations that humans are currently using but may have lower value. So these are croplands where the soil condition is challenging for production. It has soil types that impose severe to very severe limitations on production. We also found pasture with challenging soil conditions, and then we did include pasture lands that could be forest as well. The other lower value land use that we used were frequently flooded landscapes. So these can actually be quite high value in that the alluvial deposits can result in rich agricultural lands in production, but these are places that are experiencing a flood event once every 5 years now, and under climate change, we expect them to be experiencing flood events more frequently. And so we thought, okay, maybe there could be enough incentive with losing production every 5 years to merit investing in reforesting those locations. And then finally, we looked at places that have the potential to offer high co-benefits. So these also include those floodplains because upstream forests can help protect downstream communities, as well as locations within 30 meters of streams and water bodies, because that forest cover can help, for example, prevent nutrient runoff from agricultural lands getting into sensitive water systems. We looked at urban open space. So we weren't modeling sort of individual tree by tree plantings within cities. Those definitely are an important element to incorporate, but our carbon estimates were based off sort of patches of forest. So we were looking for more open sort of parks, roadside schools, places where you could put substantial additional tree cover. And then finally, we looked at places that fell within the sort of temperature envelope that species will need to migrate through if they want to stay within their comfortable thermal envelope as the climate warms. This was basically a massive GIS overlay project, and sort of all the details are here, which I definitely don't expect you to read, but just to walk through sort of the main elements. The first question, the foundational data set was, is it appropriate for greater than 25% tree cover? Yes. From those areas, we then removed locations that were not appropriate for additional trees, so places that currently have forest cover, places with perennial ice, snow, open water. We also removed fast roads because fixed objects along highways can exacerbate safety issues. So we did leave in the smaller roads because there's research to show that something about having trees on smaller roads actually cues us psychologically to slow down, and you can have better outcomes with trees there. We removed wilderness areas because regulations preclude any intervention in those locations. And then lastly, good cropland, because we want to protect our food security, of course. And what's left are 30-meter resolution maps of all the locations that are biophysically appropriate for reforestation. And we make all of these maps available if you too want to play with them. But we caution that the area that is shown in these maps is larger than the actual area we think is available for reforestation for 3 reasons. The first is that we went through and looked at 5,000 randomly distributed opportunity pixels across the US and determined what portion of those were erroneous. So what I'm showing you here is an opportunity within California, and here greater than 50% of that sort of viewing window around our pixel already has forest cover. So to be conservative, we said, okay, like we would not call this a real reforestation opportunity. We also took out areas that we expected to regrow based on background regrowth rates. So there are many forests, as you probably all know, that are cut down and replanted, or forests that burn down and regrow. And for it to count as a climate action, it has to represent additional action beyond that sort of baseline cycling. So we removed a proportion that we thought would come back based off of those background rates. And then last, this is the most important one, like you choose. So we don't want people to sort of look at this and be like, hey, you know, that's my back 40 or that's my yard. You know, I don't want trees there. Like that's not what we're trying to do. Like, who am I in Maryland to say where people should be reforesting areas across the US? I just want to provide information and context and then let people decide, you know, oh, that works for me, or no, that doesn't work for me at all. So I found that it's helpful, I'm going to move light from being here, helpful to see what some of these opportunities look like. So this is an example of a non-stock forest patch. I think this one's in Arkansas. This is an opportunity that is shrub scrub. This one to me looks like a post-burn landscape. Here's a protected areas opportunity. This one's in Oregon. Probably post-fire as well. Here's sort of pasture, kind of scrubby, maybe not actively used for grazing, could be restored back to forest. I think this one's in Florida. Locations within 30 meters of stream side buffer shown with the sort of green squiggles, or potentially your own backyard if you would like to restore trees there. That's what I'm doing with my own little pocket backyard. And then once we find these areas of opportunity, we estimate how much carbon could be captured if we were to reforest those. And to do that, we used Forest Service data, which is based off of FIA data, where they have growth and yield curves for standard forest types across the US. So we look at where the reforestation opportunities fall, what the natural forest type would be, and multiply those through to get overall climate mitigation per year in terms of CO2 per year. And I'll flag actually that the Forest Service just put out new carbon accumulation estimates. So we're in the process of updating our Reforestation Hub to reflect the latest and greatest. We had the paper, it came out, but luckily we also had this great partnership with American Forest where we were able to put the data up onto the Reforestation Hub. So if you want to go to www.reforestationhub.org, you can find this website. And what I love about this website is you can play with a lot of different variables to see where different types of opportunities fall. So here is the landing page, which shows total opportunity for the US, but you can click on individual states. There's Minnesota, where we say there's up to potentially 3.6 million acres of opportunity, fairly well distributed across the state. But then you can also select, if you can see my mouse, the type of opportunity you want to look at. So maybe you're not interested in total opportunity, but streamside buffers. You can see that, oh, those are more concentrated towards the southeastern portion of the state, or urban open space, also distributed around more of the population centers within the state. And you can click on any individual county. So here I've just pulled up the numbers for Benton County, and it does the breakdown by the different categories. So highest opportunity within pasture lands, but also good opportunity within floodplain. And I heard there might perhaps be people from Wisconsin on this call as well, so you can pick any state you like. So the next take home that I wanted to emphasize is that the most promising opportunities vary by location, which I think shows the value of having sort of a menu approach. So you can really understand, okay, like I would in any restaurant, like what works for me, what doesn't work for me, do I even want to eat it? Do I want to do reforestation? I feel like this hub helps to make those that information more evident. So I can pause here too to see if there's any questions to touch on.
Yes, we did have one from Henry. Again, reminder, if you have questions, post them in the Slido. You can find that link above that Eli shared just a few minutes ago. I'll paste Henry's question here in the chat too. But he asks, TNC identifies a huge portion of Minnesota forestation opportunity on pasture lands. Are you getting feedback from grassland, prairie stakeholders, or agriculture people pushing back on growing trees on these lands?
Great, yes, thank you for that question. We've gotten pushback, and let's see, there's some of the pushback we initially got was that our first rule, like it has to occur in places that are ecologically appropriate, then 25% recover is a good rule, but we missed some areas. So there were a few locations that we pulled in that were native prairie. And so we worked carefully with more of our grassland experts across the Nature Conservancy to make sure that we had stripped those locations from the analysis. So I feel better about that one. The other is that it's an entirely open question whether or not people want to reforest pasture. Across the US, we've pulled in about 13% of the US's current pasture land, because most pasture land actually occurs on native grasslands rather than places that once supported forests. But yes, you know, there are people whose priorities are trying to improve the production of grazing lands and the, you know, soil carbon storage, for example. And that, you know, that is the choice of those who are using these data. Like, we're not trying to say what anyone should do with their lands. We're just making the opportunity obvious so people can then choose what they'd like to do. But it's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
Great. And one other that was just typed in by Soon, asking what are economic ways to plant trees across large areas? Certainly, I know we work a lot with forest landowners. It's hard to get seedlings in the first place, but then also if they want to plant, you know, 100 acres, how might they do that? So any thoughts on how we tackle that across large areas?
So that's actually a great segue into the next part. So maybe I will hold that question, but I would say, so my work is more about documenting the potential and less about the nitty gritties of actually getting trees into the ground. Unfortunately, I planted, you know, my many thousands of trees in previous jobs, but not my current one. So I suspect there are others on the call that might have a great answer to Soon's question about the most cost-effective strategies that they've found. What would it take to acquire and plant a lot of trees across the US? We had another paper where we looked at a hypothetical scenario to ask, are we ready as a nation to really scale up reforestation? And our scenario was to take that area of opportunity that we found across the lower 48 states and say, okay, what if we were to reforest 80% of the opportunity on natural lands and 50% of the agricultural land opportunity? And then we were to plant them all, you know, not rely on natural regrowth. That would mean 64 million acres, 30 billion trees, somewhere between $24 and $53 billion to plant, and a whole heck of a lot of carbon sequestered, but big numbers. And, you know, there is a supply chain that would need to flow for that to happen. And so we modeled what it would look like to achieve that large area of planting by 2040. What that means is we would need to scale up from 1.3 billion trees planted per year to 3 billion planted per year, which is a 2.4-fold increase. So more than doubling of what we're currently doing. If we wanted to do it faster and get all the trees in the ground by 2030, that would mean a fourfold increase. So we thought, okay, that would be too much of a pinch on the supply chain to make that happen. And then we looked at, what are the various stages and what are the pinch points in that supply chain. So the first is acquiring seed, high quality seeds. We surveyed all of the nursery suppliers that we could find and got very good response rate. We got about 100% of the response from federal, 75% from state nurseries, and I think 40% from private and commercial nurseries, which is about half of the production across the US in seedlings. And what they told us is that there would definitely be a need for increasing wild seed collection. So there's a small amount of seed in storage. Many people are acquiring their seeds from orchards, but there's only so many that you can get. And of course, we'll need to establish new orchards, but that takes time. So in the short term, it would be about a 6-fold increase in wild seed production. When you think about actually growing those seeds up, we would definitely need to increase nursery capacity as well, but we are going in the wrong direction. So since 1995, in the south of the US alone, we've lost 28 federal, state, and private nurseries, industrial nurseries as well. The nurseries that are still working, about 68% of them report that they're not running at full capacity. So that's great. That gives us some room to just expand capacity within those existing nurseries. But even with the ability to increase by 34%, we would still need to expand nursery production in order to have enough seedlings. Then for outplanting, so this sort of gets to Susan's question, planting the trees themselves can be quite expensive, and finding the labor force to get those trees into the ground has been a limitation reported by many people. So we also surveyed a lot of foresters to get these findings here. And one of the issues is that often across the US, migrant labor is used to get trees in the ground. And so when immigration policies change, you can get changes in the availability of labor. And then, as I'm sure most of you know, or all of you know, that you can't just stick a tree in the ground and walk away and expect it to necessarily thrive. And trees need care until they're sort of that free to grow stage. And often people do just walk away, and failure of plantings at this stage waste all of the resources invested along the supply chain. So we need more investment in the monitoring as well as care of those seedlings after they get it. So that's the next take home, is that we do need strategic investments along the supply chain. I don't view this as a bad thing. Tree planting is something we know how to do, right? We're not waiting for technological advancements like we are for other climate solutions. We really just need to scale up a system that is already in place. I'll pause one more time. Any other questions that came across before I go to the last portion of the presentation?
There is one other. I clicked in the wrong spot. So there's the newest question. Are there any studies looking at the effects of collecting wild seed on natural regeneration? Is there a chance that significantly increasing wild seed collection could have local effects on natural regeneration? Any thoughts on that, Susan?
Oh, that is an interesting question. And I'd love to hear the thoughts from others on the call too. I don't know of any study that has looked at that. I'm so glad that you mentioned natural regeneration, because I feel like that's something I say a lot, is that we automatically jump to the idea that we need to replant these systems, but often you just need to stop whatever the disturbance is, take the cows off, put up a fence, perhaps reduce deer populations. I suspect that's relevant in Minnesota. Stop mowing, and the system can come back on its own perfectly well without us planting for a fraction of the cost and fraction of the labor. But we'll definitely need to plant to, perhaps to accelerate the recovery of the forest, or to foster a certain type of species or genotypes, as we'll talk about next. And I don't know the answer to your question of whether massive wild seed collection would negatively impact natural regeneration? That's an excellent question. Given the overabundance of seeds that are produced, there's some that could be harvested without negatively impacting regeneration rates, but I don't know where that tipping point would be. So there's no. All right, so just to tackle the last portion of the presentation, but thank you for all of these great questions. I think we'll have more time at the end for more. I wanted to return to this slide because our goal, we knew we were doing this national level analysis and that it was only going to be so good. We had great input from our TNC colleagues and beyond about the utility of the study as we were developing it. And they would say like, you know, it's great. We've got this really great land cover data set, you know, from our state. Could you put that in? Or we've got this really great additional variable given state level priorities that we'd like to incorporate. Like, could you incorporate that? And unfortunately, we were shooting for the national level consistent analysis, and we weren't able to build in these sort of state by state rasters or variables. But we hoped that by making all of our data publicly available, people could then take, mix, match, build on what we've already done. And I was delighted to hear that the Minnesota chapter, in partnership with many others, probably some of you on this call, have already undertaken that sort of customized analysis of what we've done. So the Minnesota Million is an ambitious but realistic goal to establish 1 million acres of new forest by 2040 across Minnesota. That would capture a lot of carbon, 1.6 million tons per year, as well as all of those other ecosystem services that you might want, like improved water quality and resilience to intense rainfall and heat waves. The work is being done with a diverse and inclusive coalition of partners, including Indigenous groups and communities of color. And the focus is on reforesting public land opportunity as much as possible. Though a lot of the opportunity within Minnesota is on private land. So then thinking about where are those open land opportunities within private ownership, as well as places within riparian corridors, degraded or abandoned agricultural lands, and urban areas as well to help get these 1 million acres established. And the cool thing is that there's a lot of work thinking about using climate-informed practices to try to establish forest that will be suitable for the conditions in the future under climate change. So I very strongly remember sitting in a talk when I was a grad student where the head of the New York Department of Environmental Conservation basically said, we're going to have really crappy forests for a long time because trees are slow growing, they're slow moving, and the climate is changing fast. And so can we get ahead of that when we're thinking about reforesting these lands and think about what are the species and genotypes that are more likely to thrive under future climate conditions? So the Minnesota Million has a technical working group. Some of you may be on this call with a lot of different partners. And that group is thinking about how to develop refined opportunity maps across Minnesota, incorporating that state and local knowledge that we were not able to incorporate, and find the types of opportunities that are most likely to be useful and viable within Minnesota, including these urban opportunities, riparian open space locations, as well as are there ways to incorporate additional trees on farms through like windbreaks or other strategies. Get more refined costs that are more precise in Minnesota, and assess opportunities to tap into existing programs to get this work done. And the key themes that have been arising in discussions, I should say I'm just presenting this information here. So if there are specific questions about the Minnesota Million, I'm hoping that those of you on the call who are much better versed will come in and provide more detail. But the three themes are, how do we use this work to do it in a culturally sensitive way and help to advance environmental justice? How can we think about building the forest of the future and, sorry, I gotta move stuff around, and develop innovative financing mechanisms for funding this work, such as tapping into the burgeoning carbon markets that we are all seeing growing. what would it take to restore 1 million acres by 2040? Lots of partnerships, so radical partnerships across organizations and communities to make sure it's done right, it's done well. 56,000 acres per year, which I'll talk about a little bit more. A lot of landowner engagement and a lot of seedlings, 780 million seedlings, and up to 1.78 billion. So right now in Minnesota, about 6,000 acres per year are being reforested. So to get to 1 million acres by 2040, that would be 50,000 additional acres per year, assuming that planting starts in 2023, because we need to get a program up and running. Most of the opportunity is on private lands, 85%. So that means a lot of engagement with individual landowners. The estimate is it would be about 350 private landowners per year, assuming sort of average parcel size that would need to be enrolled in the program. For seedling production, as we talked about, you need to make sure that you have those seedlings ready to go. The current level of seedling production in Minnesota is just over 6 million per year. So that would mean an additional 43 million seedlings per year needed, or an 8-fold increase in production to reach that 780 million seedling requirement to plant this area. Of course, to generate that many seedlings will require partnerships with state and commercial growers as well. But I did also want to touch on this fun pilot program that the Minnesota chapter is doing, where they're partnering with 15 farms and the University of Minnesota Duluth and others to try to develop and grow those climate adapted trees, species and genotypes that will be better suited for conditions of the future to help create the supply chain of climate informed seedlings. And then of course, funding. So planting costs will range from 532 million to 1.78 billion, or 29 million to 98 million per year. But I do want to emphasize, because I know that sounds like a lot of money, that's an enormous amount of money, but I want to emphasize two things. The first is that climate change is also very expensive. Mopping up after the increasing weather disasters that we're seeing, as well as adapting our infrastructure to deal with future climate conditions, is going to cost a whole heck of a lot of money. And so better to pay and invest that money now to stave off the worst effects of climate change than to pay it to deal with cleaning up from disasters after the fact. The other is that those that cost also represents employment opportunities, right? You need people to transport the seedlings, to grow the seedlings, to collect the seeds, to plant them. And those are opportunities to build and create sustainable jobs, which is especially relevant as we're coming out of this post-pandemic recession. So with that, I guess I'll repeat all of my take homes, which is that reforestation is a powerful climate solution, especially if deployed sooner rather than later. Reforestation is only one tool of many. I know that many out there are stewarding and conserving existing forest, and we need that too. We also need reductions in fossil fuels. The most promising opportunities vary by location, showing the value of this disaggregated menu of where opportunities are. And to really get reforestation to scale, we're going to need strategic investment all along the supply chain. And that there's no one size fits all. Achieving the Minnesota Million is going to require finding the solution that best fits the communities to make sure that people are happy with their forest that are being created. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you so much for letting me share our work with you. And I am really grateful for any critique and suggestions you have for our work.
Susan, thanks for a great presentation. You presented a lot of good ideas, and I'm looking forward to this Q&A as well. And it's great. We have about 15 minutes. Folks, continue to post questions. I think there's an awful lot that we can discuss related to Susan's content. And so keep them coming. And as you've seen in the chat, if you've been watching that, we really appreciate your going there and giving a question a thumbs up, or you can reply to questions. Susan's not the only one here with good information, insights, and knowledge about this topic. So please don't be shy about replying as well. Susan, the first question is, how does assisted migration impact restoration potential? Should we incorporate historic versus current versus projected future ranges and climate suitability? And if so, how far out should we be looking to balance near-term and long-term goals?
I wonder, can I actually phone a friend? Can I pull Meredith in to answer that question, since this is directly relevant to what she works on? Meredith, are you there to help?
I'm here. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, this is such a great question, and it's one that we don't want to pretend we have all the answers to by any means. I did post this in the Slido responses as well, but there is a wonderful resource out there from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science that breaks the state of Minnesota down into different ecological regions and gives some really good up-to-date information about different tree species that we might bring into our plantings that may not be sort of the traditional set, but might have a really good chance at surviving in a warmer future. And I will say too, I didn't introduce myself, so I'm Meredith Purnett with the Nature Conservancy, and I am working on climate change here locally for our chapter. One of the things that the Minnesota Million is really trying to do is to bring in different perspectives at the very beginning as planting lists get put together. So again, it'll take a lot of different minds to get at these different options.
Thanks, Meredith. Next question. How will TNC tackle the tactical or how to reforest the landscape? Susan, you're trying to not get too deep into the weeds, but we're pulling you in on these tactical questions. But how will TNC tackle the tactical? Will TNC fund local organizations like the University of Minnesota Forestry Extension, DNR, Minnesota Forestry Association, or others to implement reforestation programs? And maybe I'll add to the end of that, not just funding from TNC, but any other ideas for kind of how to get this done tactically beyond what you've already discussed?
Yeah, so I will start the question, but this is another one where I'd love to have Meredith or anyone else on the call jump in. So just to clarify, so I'm actually based on a global team, and so a lot of my work spans the entire globe, and what that means is that I'm a little bit 30,000 foot level. And, you know, I got to plant my 30,000 trees when I was a postdoc at the Smithsonian, and it was a whole heck of a lot of work and cost a lot of money to get it done. So I totally understand where this question is coming from. So what we do is really just try to understand how much carbon you can get depending on where you are in the globe or across the US. And the approach that you are taking to reforest the landscape. So there's no sort of one size fits all best approach. And partly in response to the other question, finding the tree species that are wanted by the people who live in that location and manage and own the land is really important, because if people don't value those trees, they're not going to persist. So we try to bring increased understanding of how the carbon will differ by those different approaches and locations to try to support the development of things like carbon markets. So can we get a robust estimate of how much carbon that we're likely to capture on that parcel, so that people can think about how does that pencil out with the current production value of the land? Does it make sense to try to tap into carbon markets as an additional revenue stream, as well as to inform sort of national and state level climate action plans to think about, like, okay, how much carbon could I really capture here? Does that make sense as a climate solution to meet local and state level needs? But that doesn't really get into sort of the nitty gritty of how to find funding. So I would love for others to jump in if they have any suggestions.
I can just hop in a little bit. This is Meredith again, and talk about a few of the things that we've been considering with the Minnesota Million. We have wonderful resources already available in Minnesota for reforestation on private lands, and that's through our private forest management and cooperative forest management programs through the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, as well as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, some really great funding and technical expertise available. And part of our goal is to get even more funding to those programs through policy and other initiatives. So really tapping into what's already available and growing that. But we also, as Susan alluded to earlier, want to take a look at the possibility of carbon markets that can help support and defray the costs of reforestation and even seedling production. This is going to take some jumpstart on our end. We need to raise some philanthropic and grant funding in the meantime, because our carbon markets aren't quite there, and we need to reforest now. So trying to find ways to bring in some private and to some extent public dollars to really supplement what we can do. And then finally, the infrastructure bill that was just passed included something called the Replant Act. And this is something that we'll want to take a look at for the state of Minnesota and just figure out how we can bring some of those dollars home. So a lot of new things to tap into, as well as supporting what already exists.
Thanks, Meredith. I thought that was the case about the infrastructure bill. I'm glad you mentioned that. Next question. A Minnesota study estimates the opportunity as a function of financial return to landowners, suggesting a tipping point price for converting from non-forest to forest. What are some other options in addition to economics or dollars for determining this opportunity, for expanding landowner acceptance and motivation to participate? Any thoughts?
I'll take a stab at that, which is that when we are pricing out reforestation opportunity, there's different types of cost and returns. So the first is opportunity cost. What is the value that that land is currently providing for whatever use it currently is under? And how would that opportunity be lost by restoring tree cover? And often our economic analyses assume that the sort of full opportunity cost occurs. But there are ways, so for example, urban environments where you can still maintain the land as a school, as a playground, as a backyard, but now you have tree cover. And so those opportunity costs, I think, tend to be a bit high. The other cost is actual implementation cost. And there is actually like shockingly hard, at least for where I sit, to get good estimates of how much it costs. It can be really variable depending on the project. So there, I think it's one where we just need better data to get a sense of how much it's going to cost. And then, of course, there are transaction costs. So when you're scaling up a large program, it costs money to reach out to landowners to make sure that they understand what their opportunities are. And often those costs are not incorporated into the accounting. So we need to do a better job of sort of that whole cost accounting there. And then, of course, there's sort of net returns to the landowners. So if you do a timber tree, then down the road, you have timber revenue. If you are growing, an orchard, you can establish tree cover, but also get the revenue from whatever that fruit crop was, for example. There are other ways to also incorporate trees into the landscape. So, for example, windbreaks can help improve the productivity of the system by diminishing the stress that wind imposes on the existing crop. And then, of course, there, I think, was what Henry was getting at as well. There are these just sort of other cultural values, preferences that people have for open landscapes versus forested landscapes. And those are so specific that they're very hard to incorporate into these economic analyses, but are very important as well. So I think we could do a better job of improving our economic analyses. And then, in discussion with local communities, that's where those cultural and preference values really come into play.
Great, thank you, Susan. A couple of interesting questions here. First, you talked a little bit about the importance of post-planting care. Does the $1.78 billion price tag for reforestation of 1 million acres in Minnesota include the price, the cost of taking care of and monitoring the planted seedlings, or would that be additional?
So I wonder if Meredith has an answer there. That's part of what explains the high variation that we observe in these implementation cost estimates, is sometimes they include that post planting monitoring and sometimes they don't. It is a lot cheaper to just put the tree in the ground and walk away. And often, you know, TNC projects will pencil out to be more expensive than other ones, but it's because we do put in that sort of care to make sure that they persist and last.
Yeah, so this is the upper end, and it does include that monitoring and post-planting stewardship.
Great. Thank you, both of you. Next question. I'm going to jump down a little bit because I think this is really an interesting question ecologically and so on. How does the degree of isolation affect reforestation opportunity? For example, do large isolated areas differ in potential from smaller areas already adjacent to existing forests?
Definitely. So one of the main factors that influence whether you can use natural forest regrowth is whether or not you are adjacent to existing forest, because those forests act as seed sources. And so that's key. If you've got patches within forests, you're much more likely to be able to use natural forest regrowth. And, you know, to Sun's question of what are the most economic ways to plant trees, one of the most economic ways to plant trees is just to let the forest grow back on its own. The other thing that we've taken into account in some of our analyses is just distance to road, because if it's close to a road, then you can get the truck in there with the seedlings, you can get people to the site, whereas it can be much more expensive to try to haul seedlings deeper into the landscape to establish.
Great. Next, Minnesota TNC's publication, Nature and Climate Solutions for Minnesota, said avoided forest conversion and peatland conservation offer up to 10 times faster carbon sequestration rates than reforestation. Should we focus on protecting peatlands more than on reforestation?
So my answer to this is, if we could do it all, let's do it all, as far as natural climate solutions go. But I'm a forest restoration scientist. I like thinking about new forest. I like thinking about planting trees, but it often is more cost effective, biodiversity effective, time effective to protect carbon stores within intact ecosystems than to try to regrow them after the fact. And so protecting standing forest and protecting existing peatlands is definitely a critical action if they're at threat. That said, we also need to remove additional carbon from the atmosphere. And so we do need solutions like reforestation, which will be providing that additional carbon capture, not just protecting existing stores.
Yeah, all of the above. Sounds good.
All of the above.
Let's do one more question, and I think we're at our time. Before I ask this last question, I want to remind folks, I did put the continuing education credit link in the chat. So if you're if you'd like to get 1 hour of continuing ed credit, go ahead and complete that form. It's very quick. We need you to do that as soon as possible. The final question, and then Matt will close us out. Your 30-meter land cover maps missed a significant forested landscape in terms of windbreaks planted by farmers since the 1930s. Many of these have been removed over time by farmers, and I remember just in the last few years, we've lost a lot of these acres. I don't see any group leading a replacement. Susan, I think you at least mentioned this during your talk, but any thought on the potential for windbreaks contributing to the goal that you've been discussing?
Yes, so my focus is about putting trees back where they've been lost. And so we wouldn't have picked up the importance of protecting these existing windbreaks. But we did do that. For example, we had an NCS Canada study where the big deal there was actually not establishing new windbreaks, but protecting standing ones, because they see the same things where people are removing them. And they definitely have a role to play. So you can establish windbreaks, you can get sort of the buffering from the wind, that's important, and you can capture additional carbon. And it's, as I was saying, with respect to protecting intact forests and peatlands. It's good to protect trees that are already standing than to try to regrow them after the fact where it's possible. As far as specific groups leading the charge, this falls into the agroforestry bucket, and we do see a lot of growing interest in agroforestry. It's sort of a win-win-win for improving farm sustainability, capturing carbon, as well as some biodiversity benefits as well. So I think there's growing interest, but I'm not sure in Minnesota what group is leading the charge.
Great. With that, Matt, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Meredith. Thanks, Eli, for handling all those questions. Let's give them a virtual round of applause. Really appreciate you being with us here this morning. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and I really appreciate the in-depth analysis that TNC and your partners have done around tree planting and where it's feasible and where the places to target. Yeah, I was interested to see, I think, Meredith, you mentioned the Replant Act. That's a part of the infrastructure bill, which I think we should all be aware of. And there's some things on tree planting there. So maybe another strategy that might be able to help. Just another quick reminder about where we're going the rest of this week. This is the roadmap. So we've talked about kind of reforestation with Susan and Meredith today. On Wednesday, I'd say same time, same channel. It will be the same time. It is a different Zoom link. And so do consult that email that Eli sent this morning for that Zoom link. We'll talk about using artificial intelligence and machine learning in this idea of how do we find ways to sequester carbon and what does that mean for markets? And so kind of a new way to look at technology there. And then on Friday, we'll talk more about the uncertainty of some of the estimates that we're dealing with and how it informs management. So with that, thank you again, Susan and Meredith and Eli, for handling all those questions. We'll sign off and hope to see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you so much for listening to our work.